Well, and this narrative frustrates me the most when it comes to situations like what you see in Chicago. I mean, the most violent weekend in 60 years, during these protests and people dying. I mean, there was a piece that ran that detailed each of the shootings, and it was basically 10 minutes later, another person getting shot in a car, like, 6 blocks away. And it just jumps around these different neighborhoods and these different, very similar stories. And I would think that would be huge national front page news. Everybody saying, look, this is a great American city that's been racked with violence that ranks higher than anything they've seen in half a century in terms of a confined space of time. And yet that wasn't getting any kind of attention whatsoever. And there weren't calls for, impeaching the people in charge and making big changes or increasing police presence in these areas in any significant way. Is this just a situation where the traditional, media, the corporate media is just so focused on their larger ideological priorities, their narrative of what's going on, that they ignore what the big stories really are?
Well, I guess there are a couple ways to look at it, which is that police incidents involving Black suspects that end the way it did with George Floyd or some of these other cases that I mentioned earlier are rare. Mm-hmm. I mean, to put it crudely, the Chicago day in and day out gunfire are the planes that land safely and don't get covered by the media. The police encounters are the plane crashes that get all the attention. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to look at it. Just as an aside, what the double whammy in the Chicago case is that Chicago, like a lot of these large urban police departments, has what's called a very low clearance rate for many of these murders, meaning many of them don't get solved then. These Black people die and their killer is never caught, never brought to justice. And it's interesting that is happening at a time when there are these calls to defund police and provide them with fewer resources. Mm-hmm. I mean, if anything, if you care about Black lives, wouldn't we want to get to the bottom of who's responsible for killing so many of these young Black men? Yet, again, that is something that just goes by the wayside.
I have been keeping track. I have this one thread on Twitter of people who are legitimately making the argument that podcasters could replace the police. And the whole thing started because I thought somebody was making a funny joke, and I retweeted it. And then I went to her Twitter thread and I realized she was actually making the argument that no, podcasters would be better at solving crimes, at solving murders than the police would. She would have like a long argument for it. And so I've been just noting these different ones where they say podcasters. But when you say that thing about that clearance rate, can we just send all the podcasters to Chicago to take care of this?
No, it is.
Way?
It's very telling. You have 7,400 Black homicides in this country every year. We know that police are responsible for maybe 2 or 3% of them. So even if the protesters are 100% successful in ending police violence against Blacks,
it's a drop in the bucket.
What I'm talking about here is the priorities and what is to be emphasized if your goal, in fact, is to reduce that Black body count. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's not to say you ignore police abuse. It's not to say we can't talk about police reforms or making it easier to prosecute bad police officers and so forth, or improving police tactics. Let's have all of that conversation. But we really need to put it in a context and to make policing the center of this discussion about the Black homicide rate in this country is so far off base as to be ridiculous.
I think that one of the problems here too has to be that the politicians who would traditionally engage on these subjects feel very uncomfortable when dealing with issues of race. They fear being depicted as racists, and so they don't say the kind of things, they don't outline the kind of points that you're making here. Is this a serious, is this an issue where they can seriously overcome that, you think, in a moment when that's demanded of them? Or is it going to be like we're seeing, frankly, in my opinion, from this White House, where they feel paralyzed in talking about the issue, and they aren't there? It's the worst of both worlds, because the president kind of veers in the direction of law and order because that's his instinct, but he cannot speak to this in any way that doesn't come across as if he's just demagoguing, as opposed to putting forward something that can help address the very legitimate concerns people have about the system as it goes to cops getting away with things and that type of thing, but also recognizes the truth of the situation, that the crime problem here is so big, and the homicide problem is so big, that it vastly outweighs what bad things cops may be doing within these communities.
Well, someone once said, when you want to help someone else, you tell that person what they need to hear. When you want to help yourself, you tell that person what they want to hear. Politicians are largely about helping themselves. Their inability to think past the next election is famous. They're not known for having particularly stiff spines. There are exceptions, of course, but they remain exceptions. I don't look to our politicians to step up to the plate here. They could, and they could start by going around these activists who I don't think are speaking for the people they claim to be speaking for. Black people call the police more than anyone else in the country, which is an odd way of showing you don't trust them. Yeah. These police officers are responding to where the 9/11 calls originate. And this idea that these neighborhoods are being over-policed is not borne out by the facts.